A law written over a century ago is about to break down, not because of a drought or a flood, but because of a specific date, December 31st, 2026. On that day, the complicated rules that keep the American Southwest going just disappear. The legal setup that manages water for 40 million people across 7 states and 2 countries vanishes at midnight. What happens next? That's the terrifying question nobody can answer. This isn't about some future climate disaster. It's about a deadline we made ourselves. It's an expiration date for an entire way of life, one that was built in the driest parts of a continent, and it's happening right now. The whole system basically comes down to 2 huge reservoirs. They're the biggest ones in the United States: Lake Powell, held back by the Glen Canyon Dam in Arizona, and Lake Mead, sitting behind the iconic Hoover Dam on the Nevada-Arizona border. For ages, these were symbols of American ambition. We tamed a wild river, made the desert green. But today, they're just showing us how close we are to collapsing. Those white rings on the canyon walls, like a giant bathtub, are a constant glaring reminder of how much water we're missing. It's a water debt that just gets bigger every single day. But here's the kicker. The real story. The absolute worst case scenario isn't dead pool. That's the number you hear on the news. The point where water literally can't flow past the dams anymore. The actual crisis, the one that hits way sooner, is the hydropower cliff. It's a specific elevation in Lake Mead, 1,035 feet above sea level. On July 16, 2026, the lake was at 1,042.24 feet. That's less than 8 feet of wiggle room. When Lake Mead drops below that 1,035-foot mark, the Hoover Dam's ability to generate power, the power that lights up Las Vegas, Arizona, and Southern California, doesn't just slowly decline. It falls off a cliff, a sudden, massive 70% drop in output, from over 1,300 megawatts down to just 382. That kind of event could totally mess up the Western power grid, and it could happen before the end of this year. To get why a functioning society ends up in such a risky spot, you have to understand the basic mistake it was built on. It's a mathematical error, locked into law, from a time before most of the cities it serves even existed. November 24th, 1922, a bunch of guys representing the 7 basin states, plus a federal guy watching over them, met in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They were there to sign something called the Colorado River Compact. Their goal was to divide up the river's water, to create a reliable supply that would help the West grow. They gave 7.5 million acre-feet of water each year to the upper basin states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, and another 7.5 million acre-feet to the lower basin California, Arizona, Nevada. That's 15 million altogether. Later, a deal with Mexico added another 1.5 million to that total. The numbers seemed fine at the time. They were based on what they thought was the best data about how much the river flowed. But that data was dead wrong. Horribly wrong. The measurements they used for the compact were taken during one of the wettest periods the river had seen in 1,200 years. It was a crazy fluke. The river, in an average year, according to hundreds of years of tree ring data, simply doesn't carry 15 million acre-feet of water. It's more like 12 or 13 million. The foundational document for the entire American Southwest, literally the law for this river, was based on a promise of water that, well, didn't actually exist. For 100 years, these states have been writing checks from an empty bank account. And now, after 2 decades of a relentless megadrought made worse by climate change, that account is totally dry. We're finally having to pay for that century-old mistake. This is the part the news doesn't usually get into. The problem isn't just a lack of rain or snow. It's about a fundamental deficit. A permanent, legally baked-in overdraft. Every single year, the states have a legal right to more water than actually flows in the river. Those massive reservoirs, Mead and Powell, were meant to smooth over a few dry years, not to prop up a permanent fantasy. For decades, they hid the problem, storing extra water from wet years. But we don't have those extra years anymore. The reservoirs are draining because the demand, which is locked into law, has never been adjusted to reality. And now, the whole system is falling apart. The 2007 interim guidelines. The 2019 drought contingency plan. These were like legal band-aids, desperate agreements made to avoid total disaster. They're the only things forcing mandatory cuts and keeping Lake Mead from hitting rock bottom. Both of them expire on the same exact day, December 31st, 2026. After that, the system legally goes back to the 1922 compact. It goes back to a world where California can demand its full giant share, no matter what it means for everyone else. It goes back to pure chaos. This is the stuff that gives water managers nightmares. It's like going back to the old days of the early 20th century, before anything was managed, when it was every state for itself. But now, 40 million people depend on what happens. The talks for what comes next, for the world after 2026, aren't going well. Earlier this year, back in January 2026, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, that's the federal agency that runs the dams, put out its draft environmental impact statement. It laid out a few options for how to manage the river once those rules expire. The response was just a jumbled mess of self-interest. On one side, you've got the lower basin states, Arizona, Nevada, and the biggest player, California. They submitted a joint plan on May 1st, 2026, which was actually a rare moment of them agreeing on something. But a lot of people see their plan as just a short-term fix, basically designed to protect their long-standing overuse of the river for as long as possible. Then on the other side, there are the upper basin states, represented by people like Becky Mitchell, Colorado's commissioner. Her point is super simple. The upper basin already takes its cuts. Their cuts are just natural. When there isn't enough snow in the Rocky Mountains, the water just doesn't flow down. They can't invent water that isn't there. She argues that the real problem is the lower basin's structural deficit. They're the ones with canals and pipelines physically pulling more water out of the system than the river can actually supply, year after year. The lower basin, she says, needs to permanently reduce how much water it uses. Into this standoff walk the negotiators. Tom Bushotsky, who's been doing water policy for 40 years, is Arizona's main negotiator. He represents the Central Arizona Project, that 336-mile canal that's vital for Phoenix and Tucson. It also has what are called junior water rights, which means Arizona is first in line for the deepest, most painful cuts. Their survival really depends on how high Lake Mead is. Then there's J.B. Hamby, who chairs the Colorado River Board of California. He was only 28 when he got a leading role, and he represents the state with the oldest and biggest water rights. California, especially the Imperial Irrigation District, was there first. And under the old, complex law of the river, being first means you have the most rights. For California, any deal that permanently cuts their share is a non-starter. They don't see the water as a shared resource. They see it as their private property, legally guaranteed. And watching all of them is the federal government, the Department of the Interior. As of 2025, under Secretary Doug Burgum and his newly appointed Acting Commissioner of Reclamation, Aubrey Betancourt. If the states can't agree by that December 31st deadline, the Secretary of the Interior has the legal power to step in and force cuts. That's the federal hammer. Nobody wants that option. It would definitely cause decades of lawsuits. But it's hanging over every meeting. It's what keeps the whole system from physically collapsing if everything else fails. Look closer, and the engineering shows just how fragile things are. Start with Glen Canyon Dam. It's this massive curved concrete wall stuck in a remote Arizona canyon. It's the single biggest power source on a 17,000-mile federal grid, providing power for 5 million people, including 53 tribal nations. But its ability to make that power depends on one number: 3,490 feet. That's how high Lake Powell needs to be. That's its minimum power pool. If the lake drops below that level, the water pressure isn't strong enough to safely spin the dam's 8 huge turbines. The dam operators, people like Deputy Commissioner David Palumbo at the Bureau of Reclamation, would have no choice. They'd have to shut them down. Now, here's the part no one on the news is talking about. This isn't just some abstract idea of not enough water pressure. It's about a destructive physical force called cavitation. To get it, you have to picture the water's journey through the dam. It drops through these enormous steel pipes called penstocks, picking up speed and pressure before it hits the turbine blades. When the lake level is really low, the pressure inside those penstocks drops, and something weird happens to water under low pressure. It boils at room temperature. Tiny, invisible vapor bubbles form in the water. As this water then smashes into the turbine blades, the pressure suddenly shoots up, and these bubbles violently collapse. Each bubble collapsing creates a microjet of water zipping at hundreds of miles per hour, plus a shockwave of energy. It's like millions of tiny explosions happening every second, right on the surface of the steel. This whole process, cavitation, can literally rip solid steel apart. It shreds turbine blades, damages the dam, and could cause a catastrophic failure. So, when they say they have to shut down the turbines at 3,490 feet, that's not really a suggestion. It's a physical necessity to keep the dam from destroying itself from the inside. A recent prediction from the Bureau of Reclamation, put out on July 16, 2026, said Lake Powell will hit 3,491 feet by March of 2027. That's just 1 foot of wiggle room, 1 foot away from a complete power shutdown. This isn't some far-off threat. It's the documented, calculated projection for 9 months from now. To prevent this, the government has been forced into desperate measures, ordering emergency releases from upstream reservoirs like Flaming Gorge, basically draining the backup savings accounts to keep the main one barely afloat. Then travel 300 miles downstream, past Lee's Ferry, which is the legal dividing line between the basins, to Hoover Dam. It's a different story here, but the stakes are just as high. Hoover was a world wonder when it was built during the Great Depression. It was supposed to last for centuries. But it wasn't designed for the world we live in now. It wasn't designed for a lake that's always less than half full. The big problem here, like I said, is that 1,035-foot hydropower cliff. And going over that cliff has immediate, massive consequences. It's not just about keeping the lights on in Las Vegas casinos. Losing 70% of Hoover's power totally messes up the entire regional grid. But the really scary thing is this feedback loop. The power from Hoover Dam is what runs the pumps. The huge pumps that push Colorado River water hundreds of feet uphill through canals to cities like Phoenix, Tucson, and Las Vegas itself, and to the coastal city of Los Angeles, served by the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. If the power generation at Hoover falters, then the ability to physically get water to millions of people falters right along with it. You need energy to move water, especially in the desert. A water crisis quickly becomes an energy crisis, which then just makes the water crisis even worse. It's a chain reaction. The federal government totally gets this. They see that cliff edge coming. On May 24th, 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation announced a $52 million emergency investment. Not to find more water, but to figure out how to live with less. They're putting in 3 new wide-head turbines at Hoover Dam. These are custom-built machines, designed to work well even when the lake levels are much lower, as low as 950 feet. It's an amazing engineering feat. But it's also a big admission of failure. The government is spending millions of dollars not to fix the problem, but to adapt to a future where Lake Mead is always dangerously close to dead pool. They're essentially trying to fix the ship while it's sinking, and given this slow-moving disaster, the short-term fixes have started to feel pretty surreal. On the same day that really bad Lake Powell forecast came out, July 16th, another deal was announced. The federal government agreed to pay the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, NWD, up to $65 million. In return, WD will leave 200,000 acre-feet of its water in Lake Mead this year, water it's legally allowed to take. Bill Hassenkamp, who manages Colorado River resources for WD, was pretty blunt. That water would maybe add 3 feet to Lake Mead's level. 3 feet isn't a drought buster, he said. It's not going to refill the reservoir, but it will mean Lake Mead stays above critical levels for a bit longer. Just think about that. $65 million to buy 3 feet of water, to buy a few more months before the lake hits that 1,035-foot cliff. It's like burning cash just to stay warm. It's a clear sign of absolute desperation. It's a tiny band-aid on a massive wound, and people are calling it a victory, a testament to collaboration. Shanti Rossett, a policy manager at MWD, had said just months before that the talks for after 2026 weren't just a routine update, but a fundamental reset of how the system may be operated. But these temporary deals are the exact opposite of a fundamental reset. They're just more of the same wishful thinking that got us into this mess. This idea that with enough money and engineering, we can just delay reality for 1 more year. But there's one city that's not counting on everyone collaborating. One city that looked at the negotiations, the failing reservoirs, and the political gridlock, and decided to build its own escape route. Las Vegas. Las Vegas gets 90% of its water from Lake Mead. For decades, its fate was directly tied to how high the lake was. A dead pool scenario would have been actual day 0 for them. The end of the city. So, while other states argued over old legal precedents from 1922, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, SNWA, did something radical. They spent something like $5 billion on what amounts to a doomsday project. It's officially called Intake No. 3. Locals just call it the third straw. It's a 3-mile-long, 20-foot wide tunnel drilled right through solid rock, deep under Lake Mead. Its opening, which is its intake, is at an elevation of 860 feet above sea level. Think about that number. Dead pool for Lake Mead, the point where water can no longer flow through Hoover Dam's intakes, is 895 feet. The Las Vegas intake is 35 feet below that. It's connected to a low-level pumping station, a huge underground cavern packed with pumps powerful enough to suck water from the very bottom of the lake and send it uphill to the city's treatment plants. The third straw is an amazing engineering feat, but it's also one of the most cynical and brilliant acts of self-preservation in water management history. It means that if, or when, Lake Mead drops below dead pool, the lights might go out in Arizona and the fields might dry up in California, but the fountains will still be running in Las Vegas. Nevada has basically separated its survival from the health of the reservoir. They've built themselves a lifeboat. They've made sure they'll be the last ones drinking from the tub. While the other states are fighting over the last few inches of water at the top of the lake, Las Vegas has a straw in the bottom, ready to drain whatever's left. It's a quiet way of saying they don't believe a good deal will happen. They're betting on failure, and you can see why they're so pessimistic. One of the most frustrating parts of this crisis is figuring out what's stealing the invisible water, even in years when the Rocky Mountains get 100% or even 120% of their normal snowpack. The relief that should flow into the river never fully shows up. 2 big forces are taking it before it even has a chance. First, there's sublimation. The dry, sunny climate means that snow often goes directly from being a solid to a gas, evaporating into the air without ever melting into water. It just vanishes. The second, and more significant, thief is the ground itself. Decades of drought have left the entire watershed super dry. The ground has a huge soil moisture deficit. So when the snow does melt, the first thing it does is soak into that dry, thirsty earth. The ground acts like a giant sponge, absorbing millions of acre-feet of runoff before even a single drop can make it into a stream and start its journey toward the Colorado River and Lake Powell. So even when the news reports a healthy snowpack, water managers know not to celebrate. They know a huge chunk of that water is already gone, claimed by the parched landscape itself. It's another tax, on top of evaporation from the reservoirs, on top of the structural deficit. Another reason why the system just can't seem to catch a break. The problem isn't just how much water there is, but when it arrives. The whole system was built for a 20th century climate, where spring snowmelts were predictable and filled the reservoirs for the hot, dry summer. That climate is gone. Climate change has made the system more unpredictable, more flashy. Winter precipitation is more often rain now instead of snow. So it runs off quickly instead of getting stored in mountain snowpack. The spring runoff happens earlier in the year, and whatever snow is left melts faster because of hotter spring temperatures. This creates a dangerous mismatch between when water is available and when we need it most. The dams were built to manage a river, but the river they were built for doesn't exist anymore. This new reality about the water is what those negotiators are wrestling with in bland conference rooms in Phoenix and Salt Lake City. They've got PowerPoint presentations and 24-month projections from the Bureau of Reclamation. They argue about how much water evaporates, about credits for water that returns to the river, and exactly what counts as a tributary. But what they're really arguing about is who's going to hurt. Who has to give something up? Does the farmer in California's Imperial Valley, whose family has been getting Colorado River water for 100 years under strong rights, have to let his fields go dry? Does the new person living in a Phoenix suburb have to be told they can't water their lawn anymore? Does a tribe with ancient, and often overlooked, water rights finally get its share, even if it means someone else loses theirs? These aren't just technical questions. They're deeply political and very emotional. They get to the core of what the American West sees itself as. The story it tells about growing, having opportunities, and forcing nature to do what we want. Brenda Berman, a former USPR commissioner who now helps run Arizona's Central Arizona Project, put it really clearly. If we fail in that job, she said, talking about the negotiators' task of finding a new way forward before the deadline, shame on us. The fact that they haven't reached an agreement yet has created a power vacuum, and it's being filled with urgent, temporary measures. That $65 million deal with Southern California is a good example. Mexico, thanks to a treaty called Minute 323, can now bank some of its saved water in Lake Mead. This has quietly and artificially kept the lake level up, providing a small but important cushion. It's a show of international cooperation, but it also shows that the system's basic rules have failed. Everyone is just making up the rules as they go, trying to keep the patient alive on the operating table with a series of increasingly risky and expensive treatments. It's really hard to grasp just how much water we're talking about. An acre-foot is enough water to cover 1 acre of land a foot deep. That's about 326,000 gallons. A typical family in the suburbs uses about half an acre-foot each year. The shortfall, the difference between what's legally promised and what the river actually provides, is millions of acre-feet every single year. The Hoover Dam itself is 726 feet tall. The water behind it, Lake Mead, when full, holds about 28 million acre-feet and stretches for 110 miles. When it's full, its elevation is 1,229 feet. Today, it's more than 180 feet below that. We're talking about a volume of missing water that's almost impossible to actually picture. It's like a ghost lake sitting in the air above where the water is now, representing 100 years of incredibly unsustainable choices. The options the Bureau of Reclamation suggested for after 2026 all come down to one tough question. How should the cuts be shared? One option is a pro rata approach, meaning everyone takes cuts based on their share. The Upper Basin and states with junior rights like Arizona favor this. It basically says, we're all in this mess together, so we all sacrifice together. Another option sticks closer to the existing priority system, that first in time, first in right idea. California likes this path best. It respects the century-old legal framework and puts the burden of cuts on those with newer rights. It says a promise is a promise, even if the reality on the ground has changed. This is the big problem. It's a fight between history and math, between what the law says states are owed and what the river can actually deliver. And the clock is ticking towards December 31st, 2026, the day the legal fiction that's papering over this whole conflict just disappears. The day the referee walks off the field. Without a new deal, the Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, will have to act. His department could, for example, just redefine what counts as beneficial use of water, which could potentially invalidate some really old rights. Or he could order a blanket cut across the whole basin. Any move like that would be an earthquake, kicking off a legal battle that would make the current talks look calm. But the alternative, doing nothing and letting the reservoirs totally crash, is unimaginable. That would mean the physical destruction of the dams and the economic destruction of the entire region. The government won't let that happen. So, if the states can't decide how to share the pain, the federal government will decide for them. And so the river keeps flowing, each cubic foot measured and managed, while the people who rely on it are standing at the edge of a cliff. The engineers like David Palumbo at Reclamation are crunching the numbers, trying to model those last few feet of decline. The new commissioner, Aubrey Betancourt, is suddenly in the middle of the frantic final months of a negotiation that's been dragging on for years. Politicians are weighing the cost of reaching a compromise against the cost of everything falling apart. Farmers are looking at the sky and at the water level in their canals. And the 40 million people who get a glass of water, grow food, or switch on a light because of this river are mostly clueless about just how close to the edge the whole system really is. 3 big questions hang over the Colorado River Basin tonight. When that December 31st deadline passes without an agreement, what's the first thing the Secretary of the Interior going to do on the morning of January 1st, 2027? Will Las Vegas's billion-dollar gamble, that third straw, end up being seen as a life-saving act of foresight, or the final, selfish move that drained the last drops from a dying system? And what does it tell us about the future of the American West when we finally officially admit that the founding promise of the region, endless growth fueled by tamed rivers, was based on a mathematical error? The water melting from the high peaks of the Rockies is on a long trip. It seeps into the soil, trickles into streams, and joins the main current. It goes through the turbines at Glen Canyon Dam, sits for a while in the hot, still water of Lake Powell, and then flows south. It reaches the intake towers of the Hoover Dam. Inside those pipes, the pressure builds. But it's less pressure than last year, less than the year before. The water molecules themselves, not compressed as much, are further apart. The huge stored energy in the reservoir is getting weaker, and at 1,035 feet, an invisible line drawn in the water by engineers, this physical decline will turn into a collapse. The river is still flowing. The laws of physics are still at play. But the laws people made are about to expire, and the system is just waiting to see what replaces them.